January 28th, 1856. Cincinnati, Ohio. U.S. Marshals smash through a door on a quiet street, and what they find inside will haunt them for the rest of their lives. A mother stands in the center of the room, blood on her hands, blood on her dress, a butcher knife trembling in her grip, and at her feet, her 2-year-old daughter, throat cut, already gone. The Marshals freeze. One of them will later say he'd seen battlefields that disturb him less than this moment, because this wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't an accident. This was a choice. A calculated, desperate, impossible choice. Her name was Margaret Garner, and what she did in that room wasn't murder. At least, not the way she saw it. To Margaret, this was love. This was mercy. This was the only gift she had left to give her child. You need to understand something right now. Before we go any further, this story will disturb you. It should disturb you. Because what Margaret Garner did wasn't a tragedy. The tragedy was that she lived in a world where what she did made sense. But here's what makes this story absolutely crucial to hear. Margaret Garner nearly disappeared from history. The system that enslaved her tried to bury what happened in that house, because her choice exposed something America didn't want to see. It revealed slavery's true face. Not the sanitized version, not the romanticized version, but the raw, unbearable truth of what it meant to be owned. Before we go deeper, subscribe to this channel right now. Stories like Margaret's deserve to be remembered, and every subscription tells YouTube that real history matters more than comfortable lies. Hit that button. She earned it with her life. So what could possibly drive a mother to kill her own child? What circumstances could twist love into something that looks like horror? And why did Margaret Garner show absolutely no remorse for what she'd done, even telling the court that given a chance, she'd do it again? To answer those questions, we need to understand who Margaret was before that frozen morning in January. We need to see the world through her eyes. We need to walk the path that led to that blood-soaked room. Because Margaret Garner wasn't a monster. She wasn't insane. She wasn't evil. She was a mother who had experienced every single horror that slavery could inflict on a woman. And when the moment came, when she heard the footsteps on the stairs and knew they were coming to drag her back, she made the only choice she believed would protect her children. The Marshals who burst through that door found 3 other children in the room, wounded but alive. Margaret had been trying to kill them all. She would have succeeded if they'd arrived 60 seconds later. And here's the part that still sends chills down the spine. When they wrestled the knife from her hands, Margaret fought them, not to escape, to finish what she'd started. "Let me go," she screamed. "Let me kill them. Please. You don't understand. You don't know what's waiting for them." But she knew. Oh! She knew exactly what was waiting. See, Margaret Garner had tasted freedom for exactly 17 hours. 17 hours where her children breathed free air. 17 hours where she didn't belong to anyone. 17 hours that were about to be ripped away. Because in 1856 America, freedom for people who looked like Margaret wasn't a right. It was a crime. And the man leading the Marshals through that door, the man demanding his property be returned to him, that was Archibald Gaines, Margaret's enslaver. And almost certainly, based on the evidence, based on the testimony, based on the appearance of her children, the father of the child she'd just killed. Think about that for a moment. Really think about it. A man who repeatedly raped a woman, who fathered children with her through violence, who owned her body like livestock. That man stood in a courtroom and demanded she be returned to him. And the law said he was right. The law said Margaret Garner was his property. The law said her children were his property. The law said freedom was just to grant or deny. But Margaret had other ideas. And what she did next would force an entire nation to confront a question it desperately wanted to avoid. What kind of country makes death look like love? Let's go back to where this really started. Not in that blood-stained room in Cincinnati, but on a plantation in Kentucky, where Margaret learned exactly what slavery meant for a woman. Kentucky, 1856. The Gaines plantation sits on the banks of the Ohio River, close enough to freedom that Margaret can see it from where she works. On clear days, she can look across the water and watch free people moving through Cincinnati streets. They're less than a mile away. They might as well be on the moon. Margaret Garner is 23 years old. She has 4 children. Thomas is 6. Samuel is 4. Mary is 2. And baby Priscilla is only 9 months old, still nursing at Margaret's breast. Here's what historical records tell us. Margaret is intelligent, proud, and according to every account, devoted to her children with a fierceness that everyone who knew her commented on. She keeps them as clean as she can manage. She teaches them what little she's allowed to teach. She holds them at night and whispers stories. Try to give them something beautiful in a world designed to crush them. But here's what the records also tell us, though they say it more quietly. Margaret's children are light-skinned, lighter than her husband Robert. And there's only one reason for that. In 1856 Kentucky, Archibald Gaines owns Margaret's body. He doesn't just own her labor or her time. He owns her completely, and he exercises that ownership in the most violent way imaginable. He rapes her repeatedly, for years. And the law doesn't call it rape, because you can't rape your own property. Think about what that does to a person. Not just a physical violation, though that's horrific enough, but the complete erasure of your humanity. The knowledge that there's no one to appeal to, no authority that recognizes your pain, no court that will hear your voice. The man who violates you owns your children. He might sell them tomorrow. He might sell you tomorrow. He might do anything he wants, and the entire weight of American law backs him up. Margaret lives with this every single day. She watches her children grow and sees their father's features emerging in their faces. The face of the man who rapes her. She knows that her daughter Mary, the sweet 2-year-old who follows her everywhere, exists because of violence. And she knows something else too. Mary is pretty. In a few years, Mary will be old enough to experience exactly what Margaret experiences. That's the future Margaret sees when she looks at her daughter. Not childhood, not innocence, not possibility. Just the endless repetition of trauma, generation after generation, with no escape and no end. Her husband, Robert, is enslaved on a neighboring plantation. They're allowed to see each other, but their marriage exists only at the pleasure of their enslavers. Robert knows what Gaines does to Margaret. Of course he knows. Everyone knows. And there's nothing he can do about it. Nothing any enslaved man could do about it without getting himself killed. So Robert and Margaret do what thousands of enslaved people did. They whisper about freedom. Late at night, in stolen moments, they plan. They look across that river and imagine what life could be on the other side. They talk about their children growing up as free people, learning to read, choosing their own paths, belonging to themselves. But it's not just dreaming, because in 1856, there's a network. The Underground Railroad is real, operating in secret, helping people escape. And Margaret and Robert start making connections. They start learning the routes. They start preparing. Here's what makes their situation particularly cruel. They can see freedom. The Ohio River is narrow at this point. On a clear day, Margaret can see individual buildings in Cincinnati. She's close enough that if she shouted, someone on the other side might hear her. But that river might as well be an ocean because of one piece of legislation. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. This law says that even if enslaved people make it to free states, they're not free. Slave catchers can hunt them down, drag them back, and the law requires northern citizens to help. It means freedom isn't a place. It's a constant state of running. It means the entire country is a prison, with some sections just having slightly longer leashes. Margaret knows this. She knows that crossing the river doesn't guarantee anything. But here's what she also knows. Staying guarantees everything terrible. Staying guarantees her daughter will be raped. Staying guarantees her sons will be beaten and broken and possibly sold away from her. Staying guarantees that nothing will ever change, that this horror will continue until she dies, and then her children will live it, and then their children. So Margaret makes a decision. They're going to run. All of them. Robert's parents too. 9 people total. They'll cross the frozen river in the dead of winter and take their chances in Cincinnati. Maybe they'll make it to Canada. Maybe they'll find permanent freedom. Maybe they'll get caught. But anything is better than the certainty of what stays on this side of the river. January 27th, 1856. The temperature drops. The Ohio River starts to freeze. And Margaret Garner looks at her children and thinks, this is it. This is our moment. Tomorrow, we run toward freedom. She has no idea that in 24 hours, she'll be holding a bloody knife. She has no idea that her daughter Mary has less than a day to live. She has no idea that she's about to become the most controversial figure in America. All she knows is that tonight, her children sleep as slaves. And if everything goes according to plan, tomorrow night, they'll sleep as free people. But nothing is going to go according to plan. January 27th, 1856. Midnight. The temperature has dropped to brutal levels, but Margaret Garner sees the ice forming on the Ohio River and knows this is their chance. Ice means they can walk across. Ice means they don't need boats or help from strangers who might betray them. Ice means tonight is the night. 9 people prepare to run. Margaret and Robert. Their 4 children, Thomas, Samuel, Mary, and baby Priscilla. Robert's parents, Mary and Simon. They bundle the children as warmly as they can with the scraps they have. Margaret ties Priscilla to her chest, feeling the baby's heartbeat against her own. 1 heartbeat. That's all that separates life from death on a night like this. They slip out after the plantation goes dark. Every footstep in the frozen mud sounds like a gunshot to Margaret's ears. She keeps expecting shouts, dogs, the crack of rifles. But nothing comes. They make it to the riverbank. And this is where it gets terrifying. The Ohio River isn't completely frozen. It's a patchwork of ice and open water. They can see the gaps even in the darkness. 1 wrong step, and someone goes through. 1 wrong step, and the river swallows them whole, and the current drags them under the ice where no one will ever find them. But Margaret doesn't hesitate. She steps onto the ice with her baby strapped to her chest, and her other children following behind. Robert takes the lead, testing each step. His parents bring up the rear. And for 20 minutes that feel like 20 hours, they walk across the frozen Ohio River in the dead of night. Thomas slips once. Margaret's heart stops. But Robert catches him, pulls him up, keeps moving. They don't speak. They barely breathe. They just move forward, step by step, toward the lights of Cincinnati glowing on the far shore. And then they're across. They're on free soil. Margaret's feet touch Ohio, and for the first time in her entire life, she's standing in a free state. Her children are standing in a free state. Legally, technically, impossibly, they're free, but they're not safe, not even close. They make their way through Cincinnati streets to a specific address they've been given. A free black man named Elijah lives there. He's part of the network, someone who helps people in exactly Margaret's situation. They knock on his door at around 2 in the morning. He opens it, sees 9 freezing people who just risked their lives crossing a frozen river, and pulls them inside without a word. For a few hours, Margaret lets herself believe it worked. Her children are warm. They're safe. They're free. She can see Thomas and Samuel starting to relax, the constant fear in their eyes beginning to fade. Mary falls asleep in her arms. Priscilla nurses and seems content. These are the only free moments her children will ever know, because someone talks. That's what happens. Someone always talks. Either someone sees them crossing a river, or someone in Cincinnati recognizes them, or maybe there's an informant in the network itself. We don't know exactly how it happens. But by morning, Archibald Gaines knows his property has escaped, and he's coming to get it back. Gaines doesn't come alone. He brings U.S. Marshals. He brings local police. He brings a full weight of federal law. Because remember, the Fugitive Slave Act says Ohio has to return escaped slaves to their enslavers. He has paperwork. He has legal authority. He has guns. They surround Elijah Kite's house around 9 in the morning. Margaret hears the footsteps first. Heavy boots on the wooden porch. Men's voices conferring. The sound of weapons being readied. And she knows instantly what's happening. After 17 hours of freedom, they've been found. Robert tries to fight. He grabs anything he can use as a weapon. The other men with him do the same. They're not going back without a fight. But what are they going to do against U.S. Marshals with rifles? What can unarmed, exhausted men do against the law itself? Margaret hears someone start to break down the door. She hears Robert shouting. She hears her children starting to cry. And in that moment, everything crystallizes for her. Everything becomes absolutely clear. They're going to lose. The Marshals are going to break through that door, and they're going to drag her family back to Kentucky. And everything waiting for them, there will be worse than what they left. Gaines will be furious. The punishment will be severe. Her boys will be beaten. she'll be raped with renewed viciousness. And Mary, sweet, innocent, 2-year-old Mary, will grow up to experience everything Margaret has experienced. Unless Margaret does something right now. She looks around the room and sees a butcher knife on a table. Elijah Kite uses it for cooking. It's meant for cutting meat, preparing food, ordinary domestic tasks. Margaret picks it up. The weight of it feels strange in her hand. She's never hurt anyone in her life. She's never wanted to hurt anyone. But what she's about to do isn't about hurting. It's about saving. The door splinters. Margaret can see hands reaching through, trying to unlock it from the inside. She has maybe 30 seconds. Maybe less. Her children are clustered together, terrified, not understanding what's happening. Robbers at the door, fighting, buying her whatever time he can. Margaret makes her choice. She grabs Mary, her 2-year-old daughter, and she does what she believes is the only act of love left available to her. She draws the knife across her daughter's throat. Mary dies almost instantly. Margaret feels her go limp, feels the blood hot against her hands. And she doesn't stop. She reaches for Samuel. She reaches for Thomas. She's trying to save them all. She's trying to give them the only escape that the law can't reverse. The door bursts open. U.S. Marshals flood into the room. They see Robert fighting. They see Margaret with a knife. They see the children. They see the blood. And they see Mary's small body on the floor. One marshal will later say he stood frozen for a full 5 seconds, unable to process what he was seeing, unable to understand that what looked like murder was meant to be mercy. They wrestle the knife away from Margaret. She fights them, not to escape, but to finish. "Let me go," she screams. "Let me save them. You don't understand. You don't know what's waiting for them." But they do take her. They take all of them. Robert, the children, Margaret with blood soaking through her dress. Archibald Gaines stands outside, waiting to reclaim his property. And he's looking at a dead child and a woman who's just become the most dangerous enslaved person in America. Because Margaret Garner has done something unthinkable. She's shown the entire country what slavery really means. She's forced everyone to see what happens when you strip people of their humanity so completely that death becomes preferable to life. And now she's going to trial. The question is, will she be tried as a murderer or as property? Will the court recognize her as a human being capable of crime, or as a thing that can't be held responsible for anything? Margaret already knows the answer, but she's about to make America hear it anyway. The Marshals drag Margaret Garner out of Elijah Kite's house in chains. Blood covers her dress, her hands, her arms. Her surviving children are wounded but alive. Thomas has a gash on his head. Samuel's throat is cut, but not deep enough to be fatal. They'll live. Margaret had been trying to prevent exactly that. Within hours, the news explodes across Cincinnati, then across Ohio, then across the entire nation. Telegraph wires carry the story to every major city in America. An enslaved woman tried to murder all 4 of her children rather than let them be returned to slavery. She succeeded in killing one, and when asked if she regretted it, she said no. That last part is what makes this story detonate like a bomb. Margaret Garner shows no remorse. None. When they question her, when they demand to know how she could do such a thing, she looks them in the eye and says words that will be quoted in newspapers for months. "I will go singing to the gallows rather than be returned to slavery." She's not asking for understanding. She's not begging for mercy. She's telling them plainly, death is better than what you're trying to send me back to. Death for me. Death for my children. Any death is better than slavery. The abolitionist sees on her story immediately. Here is proof, undeniable, blood-soaked proof, that slavery is so horrific that mothers would rather kill their children than see them enslaved. William Lloyd Garrison publishes editorials. Frederick Douglass speaks about her case. Anti-slavery newspapers run her story on the front page with headlines that make readers sick. Mother kills child rather than see her enslaved. The ultimate sacrifice. What slavery makes of love. But the Southern newspapers tell a different story. They call Margaret insane. They call her a savage. They say this proves that enslaved people can't handle freedom, that they need the structure and guidance of slavery, that without white control, they descend into barbarism. They twist her desperate act of protection into evidence that slavery is necessary. And the general public? They're horrified, confused, struggling to process what Margaret has done, because it violates every instinct about motherhood, about protection, about love. How can killing be loving? How can murder be mercy? The only way it makes sense is if you accept Margaret's premise that slavery is worse than death. And most Americans in 1856 aren't ready to accept that premise. Margaret sits in jail waiting for trial. She doesn't get to hold her surviving children. They've been taken away, held as evidence, treated as property subject to legal dispute. Baby Priscilla, still nursing, is ripped from her mother's arms. Margaret's milk comes in with no baby to feed. That's another kind of torture altogether. Her lawyers arrive quickly. Abolitionists fund her defense immediately because they understand the stakes. This isn't just about one woman. This is about forcing America to confront what it's built. If Margaret can be tried for murder in Ohio, that means Ohio has jurisdiction. And if Ohio has jurisdiction, that means she's free. Because you can't try property for murder. Only people can commit crimes. So Margaret's legal team makes an extraordinary argument. Try her for murder. Send her to the gallows if you must. Execute her under Ohio law. Because at least that would make her a person. At least that would acknowledge her humanity. Even if only to punish her. Think about that strategy. Her lawyers are literally arguing that execution is preferable to slavery. They're telling the court, kill our client if you want, but recognize her as human first. Meanwhile, Archibald Gaines is making the opposite argument. He stands in court and says Margaret Garner is his property. She's worth $1,200. That's what he paid for her. That's what the law says she's worth. And he wants his property back. The fact that she killed one child is unfortunate, but that's his property too. He suffered property damage. He's the victim here. And yes, you read that right. The man who raped Margaret for years, who fathered her children through violence, who owned her body like livestock, that man stands in an American courtroom in 1856 and claims he's a victim. He demands compensation for the child Margaret killed because that child was his property. The trial becomes a circus. The courtroom is packed every day. People line up hours early to get seats. Reporters from every major newspaper attend. Everyone wants to see this woman who did the unthinkable. Everyone wants to understand how this happened. Margaret testifies in her own defense, and her testimony is devastating. She describes her life on the Gaines plantation in calm, clear detail. She doesn't dramatize. She doesn't embellish. She just tells the truth. She tells the court about the rapes, about watching her children grow up knowing they'd never be free, about seeing freedom across the river every single day and knowing it was forbidden to her, about the exact moment she heard the marshals breaking down the door and realized what was about to happen. And then she says something that silences the entire courtroom. I knew what slavery meant for my daughter. I lived it. I would not let her live it. What I did was love. The prosecutor tries to paint her as a monster, tries to emphasize the brutality of cutting a 2-year-old's throat, tries to make the jury see her as dangerous, as someone who needs to be controlled. But Margaret won't play that role. She keeps her dignity. She keeps her composure. And she keeps insisting that what she did made perfect sense. If you understand what slavery actually is, here's where the case takes its most twisted turn. The judge has to decide a fundamental question. Is Margaret Garner a person or property? If she's a person, she can be tried for murder in Ohio, which would establish Ohio's jurisdiction, which would make her free. If she's property, she has to be returned to Archibald Gaines under the Fugitive Slave Act. The judge rules that Margaret Garner is property, not a person. Property, which means she can't be tried for murder because property can't commit crimes. A chair can't commit murder. A horse can't commit murder. And according to the United States legal system, in 1856, Margaret Garner can't commit murder. The only person who could be charged with anything would be Archibald Gaines for property damage to his own property, which obviously isn't going to happen. So Margaret is ordered returned to Kentucky, returned to the man who raped her, returned to slavery, and her surviving children are going with her. The law has spoken. The law says she belongs to him. The law says her act of desperate love means nothing. The law says she's a thing, not a mother. But Margaret isn't done shocking America, because what happens next will prove she meant every word she said in that courtroom. The courtroom erupts when the judge delivers his verdict. Abolitionists are screaming. Margaret's lawyers are on their feet arguing. The gallery is in chaos. But none of it matters. The law is clear. Margaret Garner is property, not a person. She belongs to Archibald Gaines. And the Fugitive Slave Act says she must be returned. Margaret sits perfectly still through all of it. She doesn't cry. She doesn't beg. She just stares at the judge with something that witnesses will later describe as profound disappointment. Not in the verdict itself, but in the fact that anyone expected anything different. She knew how this would end. She's known from the moment they drag her out of that house in Cincinnati. Her lawyers try everything. They file appeals. They argue constitutional violations. They claim the Fugitive Slave Act is unconstitutional. They point out the absurdity of a legal system that says a woman can't be tried for killing her own child because she's not human enough to commit crime. But every appeal fails. Every legal avenue closes. The machinery of American law grinds forward with perfect mechanical precision, and at the end of that grinding, Margaret and her 3 surviving children are handed back to Archibald Gaines. Before they take her, a reporter asks Margaret if she has any final words for the people of Ohio. She looks at him and says, "I have no regret for what I did. If I could do it again, I would kill them all. I would kill myself. Slavery is worse than death. You will never understand that because you are free." The reporter publishes those words. They appear in newspapers across the country, and they haunt readers because Margaret isn't emotional when she says them. She's calm, matter of fact, like she's explaining basic arithmetic to a slow student. Death is better than slavery. This is not opinion. This is mathematics. This is observable fact. Gaines takes Margaret and her children back to Kentucky in March 1856. But he's not stupid. He knows that keeping Margaret anywhere near the Ohio border is dangerous. She tried to escape once. She killed one of his most valuable pieces of property in the process. And worse, much worse, she's become famous. She's become a symbol. Abolitionists know her name. They're watching what happens to her. If she stays in Kentucky, there will be rescue attempts. There will be more trouble. So Gaines does what enslavers always do when enslaved people become inconvenient. He sells her south, deep south. He arranges for Margaret and her surviving children to be sent to a plantation in Arkansas, then redirects them to Louisiana. Because Louisiana is about as far from freedom as you can get in 1856. Louisiana is where hope goes to die. They transport Margaret and her children by steamboat down the Ohio River, then down the Mississippi. It's a journey that takes weeks. And during this journey, something happens that history records but can't quite explain. The steamboat is called the Henry Louis. On the night of March 23rd, 1856, somewhere between Cincinnati and Louisville, the boat collides with another vessel in the darkness. It's not a major accident. Nobody dies. The boat is damaged but stays afloat. There's chaos, confusion, shouting, people rushing around in the dark. And in that chaos, 9-month-old Priscilla, Margaret's youngest child, the baby she carried across the frozen Ohio River, the baby she nursed in jail, falls overboard into the Mississippi River, the dark, cold, turbulent Mississippi River, and Priscilla drowns. That's the official story. That's what the boat's records say. That's what gets reported. An accident during a collision. A tragic loss of property worth approximately $300. But here's what makes people wonder. Margaret was right there. She was holding Priscilla when it happened, and multiple witnesses later say that Margaret didn't scream, didn't cry out, didn't reach for her drowning baby. She just stood at the rail and watched the water swallow her daughter whole. Some historians think it was an accident, that Margaret was too traumatized to react. Others think Margaret was in shock, frozen, unable to process another loss. But many people who study this case believe something else entirely. Margaret let her baby go. She saw the chaos, saw the opportunity, and she gave Priscilla the only gift she had left to give: freedom through death, escape through drowning. One final act of mercy. We'll never know for certain. Margaret never spoke about it. But think about what she said in that courtroom. I would kill them all. Think about what she demonstrated on that morning in Cincinnati, that she believed death was preferable to slavery. And now ask yourself, if you were Margaret Garner, if you'd just been dragged back into slavery, if you were being shipped to Louisiana, where the work was brutal and the survival rate was low, if you were holding your baby and suddenly the boat lurched and the water was right there, what would you do? Would you hold tight, or would you let go? Margaret arrives in Louisiana with only 2 children now, Thomas and Samuel. Mary is dead by her hand in Cincinnati. Priscilla is dead in the Mississippi River, half her children gone. And she's about to disappear from history entirely, because enslaved people in Louisiana don't leave many records. They work, they suffer, and they die, usually within a few years of arrival. Margaret Garner dies sometime around 1858. She's approximately 25 years old. The records say typhoid fever, which is what they always say when enslaved people die young in Louisiana. Maybe it was typhoid. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was despair. Maybe Margaret simply decided she'd had enough and willed herself to stop living. Her 2 surviving sons vanished from the historical record. We don't know if they were sold, if they survived the Civil War, if they ever gained freedom. They became what millions of enslaved people became, nameless, faceless, erased from history. The system that enslaved them made sure of that. But Margaret herself doesn't disappear. Not completely. Because what she did in that house in Cincinnati was too shocking, too profound, too revealing to be forgotten. Her story keeps circulating. Abolitionists keep telling it. Former enslaved people who gained freedom keep referencing it. And slowly, painfully, white Americans start to understand what it means. It means slavery wasn't just unjust. It wasn't just cruel. It was so fundamentally evil that mothers preferred to murder their children than allow them to experience it. It means the system that America built, that America defended, that America went to war to preserve, that system destroyed the most basic human bonds. It turned love into death. It made murder look like mercy. Margaret Garner never lived to see the Civil War, never lived to see emancipation, never lived to see slavery abolished. But she forced America to see slavery's true face. And America never forgot what it saw in that blood-stained room in Cincinnati. A woman with a knife, a dead child at her feet, and the calm, unwavering certainty that what she'd done was an act of love. Margaret Garner died in obscurity on a Louisiana plantation around 1858. She was 25 years old. They buried her in an unmarked grave, trying to erase her the way slavery erased millions. But they failed. Within months of her trial, abolitionists were using her story in every speech. They would describe that moment, a mother with a knife, choosing death over chains, and watch audiences sit in stunned silence. Because Margaret's act did something 1,000 speeches about abstract injustice couldn't do. It made slavery impossible to ignore. Harriet Beecher Stowe followed Margaret's trial closely and incorporated elements of her story into later writings. The image of a mother willing to kill rather than see her child enslaved became one of the most powerful symbols of the abolitionist movement. Southern newspapers attacked Margaret viciously, calling her insane, calling her a monster. But underneath that attack was fear. Because Margaret's choice exposed a fundamental lie holding the system together, that enslaved people were content, that slavery was benign. If that were true, why would a mother kill her own child rather than return? The South had no answer, and Margaret wasn't unique. She was just the one who got documented. How many other mothers made the same choice in places where no reporters came, where no trials happened, where the only record was a line in an account book? We'll never know. But Margaret wasn't alone in her desperation. Jump forward to 1987. Toni Morrison publishes Beloved, a novel based directly on Margaret's story. It wins the Pulitzer Prize and becomes one of the most important American novels of the 20th century. Morrison said she wanted to honor Margaret by giving her the interior life that history denied her, by showing not just what Margaret did, but why it made terrible, perfect sense. So what does Margaret's story teach us 169 years later? It teaches us that resistance takes many forms. Margaret's resistance was refusing to accept a future of trauma for her children, even when refusal cost everything. That's resistance too. It teaches us about the inadequacy of law. American law in 1856 was perfectly clear. Margaret was property. Everyone followed the law, and the result was evil. Margaret's story proves that legal and moral are not the same thing. It teaches us to question whose stories get told. Margaret nearly disappeared from history, which means there are thousands of Margaret Garners whose names we'll never know. Our understanding of slavery is built on documented stories, but the undocumented suffering is an ocean we can barely imagine. And it teaches us about trauma's long shadow. The system that enslaved Margaret ended in 1865, but the trauma it created didn't end. It passed down through generations. We're still dealing with what slavery did to families, communities, and the fundamental ability to trust that love won't be violently ripped away. Margaret Garner stood in a courtroom and told America that slavery was worse than death. America didn't want to listen, but her voice kept echoing. Through the Civil War, through Reconstruction, through the Civil Rights Movement, through Toni Morrison's novel, through every conversation we have today about justice and what it means to be truly free, Margaret wasn't the problem. Slavery was the problem. The system that made her choice make sense was a problem. The country that built itself on stolen labor and stolen lives was a problem. They buried her in an unmarked grave. They tried to erase her. They failed, because we're still saying her name. We're still telling her story. We're still grappling with the impossible choice she made. Margaret Garner chose death over chains. And in doing so, she held up a mirror to America and said, "Look at what you've built. Look at what you've become." America looked, and it could never unsee what Margaret showed them. Her daughter Mary has been dead for 169 years. But the truth Margaret revealed, that some systems are so evil they make death look like mercy, that truth is still alive, still demanding we examine our own systems, our own comfortable assumptions about justice. Remember her name. Remember what she did. Remember why. And never let anyone tell you that slavery was anything other than what Margaret knew it to be, a horror so complete that death was mercy. Margaret Garner's story was almost erased from history. You just saved it from oblivion by watching this video. Now take it further. Subscribe so we can keep telling the stories they try to bury. Share this so more people learn her name. Comment Margaret Garner so the algorithm knows her story matters. Because every view, every share, every subscription is an act of remembrance. They tried to erase her. We won't let them. Subscribe now. She killed her own child. The court said she wasn't human enough to be guilty. This is the true story they tried to erase from history. In 1856, an enslaved woman named Margaret Garner made a choice so devastating that it would force America to confront the true horror of slavery. After escaping across